Disclaimer: the following program is designed to offend, provoke, and challenge your religious sensibilities. It contains content that will likely offend anyone who holds religion sacred. This is for those with thick skin or a taste for the harsh truth. If you're easily offended or cherish your religious views, please turn off now. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You have been warned. All right, enough playing nice with the New Testament. I've been going too easy on this book, mostly because these Matthew chapters are long, bloated, and packed with enough contradictions to dislocate your brain. So I've been trimming things down, hitting the biggest red flags, and moving on. But I guess some of you took that to mean the New Testament God is better than the Old Testament one. More peaceful, more forgiving, more reasonable, which, no. That's just fiction. The nice sounding parts get quoted in church. The rest, nobody reads because it blows up the whole Jesus is fantastic thing. So yeah, we're done speed running. From now on, we're breaking these chapters into parts and dragging every contradiction, every manipulative spin, every theological meltdown into the light. Matthew 12. It's at least a two-parter, maybe three. I'll have to see as I make it. I don't enjoy making long videos. I try to keep them under 15 minutes. But when you actually slow down and pay attention, the New Testament isn't more divine. It's just a different flavor of delusion. Also, if you're new here, we've got full playlists for Genesis, Matthew, and Revelation, all starting at chapter 1. So go binge watch those if you want the full tour of biblical chaos from page 1. And while you're at it, follow us on Twitter at VersatrolYT, where I drop updates, clips, sometimes a meme, and occasionally respond to people in the comments who really should consider booking a brain scan. All right, let's get into Matthew 12, part 1, where Jesus breaks Sabbath law, dusts off the David excuse, and randomly declares himself more important than the temple. Let's get into it. So Jesus and his disciples are walking through a cornfield grabbing food because they're hungry. But the Pharisees, because they have nothing better to do, immediately pop up like biblical Karens with, excuse me, but that's not allowed on the Sabbath. First of all, how did the Pharisees even catch them? Were they just lurking in the cornfields like some ancient version of food police? Do they just camp out on Saturdays waiting for someone to mess up? And real quick, why are the disciples even hungry? This is the Miracle Squad. They've seen Jesus feed thousands with a Lunchable. They've watched water become wine, and now they're reduced to picking grain like day laborers. If Jesus can magic up food on demand, what's the excuse here? Is this some divine object lesson, or did he forget to pack lunch for everybody? And it's ironic because earlier in Matthew 4, verse 4, Jesus told the devil, "Man shall not live by bread alone." Then a few chapters later, his own disciples are literally, well, living by bread or grain alone. You'd think that after the showdown with Satan, Jesus might keep some food handy. But nope, here they are, rummaging through plants because they have nothing to eat. Which, honestly, I find this ridiculous. These guys aren't harvesting a full crop or running a grain business on the side. They're grabbing something to eat. But no, according to Pharisaic law, even rubbing grain between your hands counted as work. Imagine dedicating your entire life to stalking people on Saturdays, hoping to bust them for grain eating. It gets even stranger when you consider that Mosaic law, Leviticus 23, verse 22, allows the poor to pluck grain from the edges of a field on regular days. But in Exodus 16, God completely flips out when people gather manna on the Sabbath instead of collecting double the day before. So which is it? Are we supposed to starve if we didn't prep properly? Or can we just grab a handful of raw corn on the Sabbath? The Bible can't seem to decide what's work versus what's just being hungry. Instead of saying, actually, the law allows this, Jesus pulls out the David defense. Did ye not read what David did when he was hungry, himself and those with him, how he went into the house of God and the loaves of the presence did eat, which it is not lawful to him to eat, nor to those with him, except to the priests alone? So he's saying, yeah, maybe we technically broke the rule, but David did something even worse, and God let it slide, so don't blame me. What kind of argument is this? David ate sacred bread meant only for priests. Jesus' disciples are eating regular grain. These two things are not remotely the same, but notice what Jesus just admitted. David's action was illegal. So if Jesus is using David's example as a defense, is he admitting that his disciples were technically breaking the law too? This is not the argument you make if you're trying to prove innocence. And as if that weren't enough of a head scratcher, the Gospel of Mark 2:25-26 adds a twist. There, Jesus says David ate the bread in the days of Abiathar the high priest, but 1 Samuel 21 clearly says the priest was Ahimelech, who just so happens to be Abiathar's father. Either Mark can't keep his priest straight, or Jesus gave the wrong name. So much for biblical inerrancy. And here's the part Jesus conveniently forgets to mention. After David took the holy bread, a little thing happened, an entire town was slaughtered because of it. In 1 Samuel 22, King Saul finds out that Ahimelech the priest gave David the bread and Goliath's sword. His response? Total overkill. Saul orders Doeg the Edomite to massacre 85 priests. Then, just for good measure, they wipe out every man, woman, child, infant, ox, donkey, and sheep in the priestly town of Nob. All because Ahimelech gave David holy food. So when Jesus uses this story as an example of divine leniency, he's leaving out the part where dozens of people die horribly as a result. Either he forgot that or he's deliberately skipping it. Either way, it's not a great look. The actual lesson from the David story is not God doesn't mind when you bend the rules. The lesson is, if you mess around with sacred rituals, innocent people get murdered. But sure, Jesus, let's use that as a positive role model. By the way, David didn't just trigger a massacre, he also lied to Ahimelech in the process, claiming he was on a top secret royal mission, 1 Samuel 21 verse 2. So we've got deceit, bloodshed, and a body count. That's who Jesus is citing as an example. Then Jesus shifts the argument again. Or did you not read in the law that on the Sabbaths the priests in the temple do profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Now, he's comparing his disciples to temple priests who had to perform work on the Sabbath, offering sacrifices, maintaining the temple, etc. But last I checked, Jesus' disciples weren't priests. They weren't in a temple. They were walking through a cornfield eating grain. Not the same thing, Jesus. And let's not skip the whole logic of Jesus here. Jesus is saying some people are allowed to break the law because their job is holy, which is basically the biblical version of rules for thee, not for me. David, special. Priests, special. Jesus' crew, special by association. This isn't a moral system, it's a privilege club. And the club members get legal immunity. It's that dreaded rules don't apply to us theme. Think of it like showing up at a nightclub and saying, I'm with the band to get past the bouncer without paying. The priests can do Sabbath work because they're in the temple, so Jesus and friends are just as special, even though they're literally strolling through a field. And then Jesus just goes for it and says, and I say to you that a greater than the temple is here. Wait, what? Where did this come from? Jesus just randomly declares himself more important than the temple with zero explanation? Imagine getting pulled over for speeding and telling the cop, well, the mayor speeds all the time, so I should be fine. Also, I'm more important than the law anyway. See how that wouldn't work? And remember that later on, this same Jesus will storm into the temple in chapter 21 and start flipping tables. So are you greater than the temple or just the guy who wrecks it when he doesn't like what's going on inside? It's amusing to claim to outrank the temple, then bursting in later to trash it. If he's so above it, maybe he could just snap his fingers and shut it down instead of flipping furniture and going ballistic. But Jesus isn't done yet. He pulls out another Old Testament verse. If ye had known what is, kindness I will, and not sacrifice, ye had not condemned the blameless. In other words, God cares more about kindness than strict rule following, which is great. So why did God make strict rules in the first place? If God was fine with people bending the law for a good reason, then why did he kill a guy for picking up sticks on the Sabbath in Numbers 15, verses 32 through 36? Jesus' logic only works if you ignore all the times in the Old Testament where God absolutely did not care about kindness over rules. And speaking of that poor guy picking up sticks, Numbers 15 is a gem of Old Testament harshness. God literally tells Moses to have the man stoned to death for gathering firewood on the Sabbath, but now Jesus is basically saying, my disciples were hungry, so it's no big deal. So lethal punishment for working on the Sabbath, or a pass if you're part of the members-only club. And let's talk about that Hosea quote. Kindness, not sacrifice, comes from a book where God spends most of his time threatening to obliterate Israel for disobedience. Hosea 6 is God mocking the Israelites for pretending to be righteous while breaking the law. It's not a soft quote, it's a threat. So if Jesus is using that to say, God's chill now, then He's either misreading it or cherry picking the only verse that fits his point and hoping nobody checks the context. And finally, Jesus drops the big one. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So he's saying, I make the rules now. Oh, okay. So Jesus just decides what's allowed and what's not? Well, then why is he even arguing with the Pharisees? If he's the Lord of the Sabbath, he should just say, yeah, I changed the rule, deal with it. Instead, he spends 8 verses deflecting, making bad comparisons, and pulling rank. And just for fun, let's notice this timeline again real quick here. First, the disciples are technically breaking the rule, but it's okay. Then they're like priests, then they're blameless, and now Jesus is Lord of the rule book anyway, so which is it? Did they break the law or didn't they? Are we making excuses or rewriting the law or just claiming holiness by association? If Jesus is saying, well, David did something worse and God let it slide, so don't blame me, then can't literally anyone use this argument? By this logic, sin doesn't actually matter as long as you can point to someone in the Bible who did something worse and still got away with it. Hey, God forgave David for adultery and murder, so can't I be forgiven for cheating on my taxes? Or Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, so my little affair isn't a big deal, right? Lot got blackout drunk and slept with his daughters, and he's still considered righteous. So what are the rules again? This completely undermines the entire concept of sin and judgment. Isn't this exactly how Christianity already operates? Christianity teaches that everyone's a sinner, but that God is willing to forgive anything, which, sure, sounds nice, until you realize that this creates a giant moral loophole where people can justify literally anything. So what's the standard here? Is the law only important when Jesus wants it to be? Can we all just do whatever we want as long as we can name someone worse? Or is Jesus just making excuses for breaking the law while pretending to be above it? That's the actual problem. Jesus isn't providing a logical argument, he's providing an excuse, and bad excuses open the door for anyone to twist the rules however they want. So did Jesus break the law or not? Because his whole defense sounds a lot like, yeah, maybe we technically broke the rule, but David did something worse, so cut us some slack. That's not a great defense for a sinless Messiah. Well, that was supposed to be part 1 of Matthew 12, as in half the chapter. But Jesus stalling out in a cornfield with a David excuse and a Hosea misquote was enough to eat the entire runtime. So yeah, this is just verses 1 through 8. That's all we got through. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, this is way too much detail, just give me the highlights, fair, let me know in the comments. I can absolutely scale these back, but personally, I like the deep dives, the contradictions, the footnotes, the weird dead-end verses nobody reads. They're where the real comedy lives. That said, I'm not married to the long form if it's not your thing. If you want shorter episodes, again, say the word. If you're down to keep going full detective mode through gospel contradictions, I'll keep digging. Either way, let me know. And while you're scrolling, like, comment, and subscribe, and follow us on X at VersatrolYT, where the content is shorter, but the sarcasm is eternal. Part 2 coming soon, unless I get smited for rubbing grain on a Saturday.